a huge tree limb just broke off and fell. After my last adventure in the botanical garden, where I stood precisely on top of a yellow jacket nest while following my, curiosity, but also my smartphone, while I was off trail. Most people would imagine that that would be a survivable mistake. However, I've had experiences with yellow jackets, and they can be lethal. I am curious where the branch fell, so I'm sort of cautiously proceeding through the gardens. In case you've never seen one of these, this is a bird of paradise flower. And this is the plant that produces them. You can see the unopened blossoms. They're gorgeous. Somewhere nearby is a tree that just dropped a huge branch, and hopefully it didn't drop that branch on a human being. I didn't hear anybody yelling, so that's a good sign. I know which kind of tree is likely to have dropped that branch. Also, though I heard the branch crack as if it were going to fall, I did not hear it hit the ground. And this is the most likely nearby culprit, a cypress tree. Those trees often drop gigantic branches, weighing up to a couple of tons, I imagine. I'm gonna try and be a lot more careful when I'm doing something that I've often advised against, which is paying attention to my smartphone when I'm outside. I entirely avoided smartphone ownership as a technician until about 3 years ago, when a specific employer sent me the one that I'm making this video on and wanted to use it to communicate with me frequently. And even after I received this phone, I resisted carrying it with me outside for a good 2 years. And also, when I did carry it, I didn't use it, right? And I remember the first time I used it, the shocking disappearance, sudden shocking disappearance of my awareness of the world around me. All I did was, look at the screen, and it seemed as though the world disappeared in my mind. My awareness of where I was, of place, of being, of relation, of danger, completely disappeared when I looked into this screen just for a few moments. I didn't find that actually I did find it terribly surprising. I had watched other people doing this for many years and had marveled at the seeming, what's the right word? The power of the device to distract and disorient us, and particularly in nature, in time, and in relationships. And those are most of what make our humanity recognizable and coherent. And so when machines disorient us there, we're really in very grave danger. I don't yet, and I probably never will, understand why the yellow jackets didn't swarm me. I was standing directly on top of their nest, but they didn't. And, explanations can be very deceptive because phenomenon can be multiply determined, right? In other words, we can find an explanation that suffices to appear, to expose the causal relationships underlying phenomenal events, expected and unexpected. But even though they suffice to explain it, reality and events are so staggeringly mysterious in their basis that the beginning of the attempt to explain it all is already hugely problematic. It involves presuppositions we have no reasonable justification for asserting. Nature doesn't function on reasons, and causes are confusedly local in time and space, which I would suggest we do not yet understand very well at all, or are almost entirely confused about. The nature of the relationship between consciousness and temporality, between existence and space-time, between our personal experience and the phenomenon. I always get the plural of that wrong. I need to study this. The phenomenon that conspire to emerge as our waking minds. But there is another kind of mind that is not like our waking mind, and is much more like the strange reflection in this pool, whereby looking down, I see up, but my eyes don't touch the things that are up. They touch their reflections in a substance that in English we call water. And as you can see, the water, its surface, is kind of alive with concentric events caused by things moving or touching its surface, primarily water striders. But this reflectivity is hypnotic and beautiful. It is enchanting. And this pool was designed for us to be able to look down into the water and see up into the sky. To see particularly the moon at night. Since the gardens are not open at night, very few people have seen the reflection of the moon in this pool, but I am one of them. Now, I don't have a particular topic before me in mind today, though I want to share some of my recent reflections and experiences, particularly about the peculiar flatness of the waking mind and its capacity to distract itself with its own productions, projections, explanations, a word that literally means to flatten out. To explain is to put on a flat surface. And we might think, well, we might reasonably think that there's a loss of dimensionality there, because here we are in ordinary four-dimensional space-time, presuming that we decide to call time a dimension. This is a little waterfall where I've often seen hummingbirds bathing. There are aquifers underneath the garden, and the engineers and the people who built these gardens on top of sand dunes long ago, the underground aquifers produce the water that supports the life here. You will notice little areas where the water is flowing. And if you observe a place where water is flowing very closely and follow the flow with your eyes again and again, when you look away, you may find that reality is warping and distorting. And this is partly due to the visual neurons becoming, what's the right word for this? Becoming in order to maintain your focus on the flowing water, your visual organs and their neurological aspects, they have to modulate, right? And this modulation creates a sort of momentum that when you look away from the flowing water, that modulating momentum continues for a little while until the organs that you see with and their neuronal elements adjust to the less fluid movements, like those of leaves or branches in the breeze, or even the stillness, the relative stillness of non-liquid phenomena. Water and fluid and flow are extremely important analogs and metaphors and similes for the dreaming mind, and this is no accident. And although our cultures and societies are inclined, at their broadest, definition, to dismiss or belittle what happens to us at night when we dream, It's long been my experience that we've got this probably almost explicitly backwards. In fact, it looks to me like we began with dreaming as children, and this is what we called imagination and play, and over time we built these structured aspects of awareness, concern, attentional function, and consciousness out of the foundations of dreaming and we kept emphasizing and rewarding that and punishing the other thing. And of course, who is we, right? I mean, the culture in general, adults, teachers, school, so on. We kept being told over and over again that imagination was relatively equivalent to nonsense. Interestingly, one has to imagine that in order to assert it. Therefore, something's fucking wrong with that idea. Now I am approaching the dangerous part of the park wherein this moon cycle, which will turn into a new moon cycle in 2 days, this part of the park, which is less visited, is likely to contain undiscovered and thus undestroyed wasp nests. This is actually one of my favorite parts of the garden because there are fewer people here. And most of the people I do encounter here are likely to be more peculiar. In any case, I've had a series of relatively astonishing dreams, even though there have been difficult transformations in dreaming for many of us during the unexpected changes and challenges we've all been facing. This is a white sage plant. Just love the scent of this plant. I'm going to take a risk and walk back here, paying very close attention to where I put my feet and the flight paths of insects near the ground. But one of the ways we can think, and there's useful ways of thinking and exploring and analogizing our relationships with consciousness. And this has just occurred to me for the first time. It's kind of peculiar. And it's probably because I've been listening to the Eric Weinstein podcast, The Portal, with Roger Penrose, who is one of the true prodigies I've had the good fortune to be born during the lifetime of. How unfortunate that I have not mastered the mathematics required to understand many of his discoveries. And the book that he wrote, called The Road to Reality, a book of some of the finest expositions of waking consciousness, is staggeringly beautiful and complex. It sits on a pedestal in my room. It's the only book that sits on an actual pedestal in my room. This is the little pond where I sometimes practice the obscure art of frog sneaking. That is the ability to sneak up on a frog without it leaping off into the water. However, I am not practicing that discipline today. And in fact, the pond is largely empty because it is an artificial pond. and it has not been recently filled. Nonetheless, there are frogs here. I have heard them in recent days when I have traversed this little bridge, and when I get to the other side of it, if you hear some plopping sounds, we might be seeing some frogs, or hearing them. Yep, there was one. There's a little bit of water left. Frog sneaking requires incredibly slow movement. You have to learn from the blue heron, the egret, the crane, how to move with otherwise unimaginable slowness. And the frogs helped me learn that by their incredible sensitivity to movement. What I was thinking a little while ago was that, in a way, to dream is to change the sign of consciousness. And if we call waking consciousness positive, then dreaming consciousness would be negative. I'm actually going to walk back and visit some plants before I dare to approach the place I survived my yellow jacket encounter the other day. Now, in consciousness, the peculiar nature of positive and negative, if we choose this analogy, which we certainly don't have to, and it could be a bad one. I mean, it could be not fruitful enough, not rich enough. Like, perhaps dreaming awareness or dreaming experience is the possibility of consciousness acquiring a sign, and waking experience is the result of it having done so. Oh, glad I walked back here. Look at that feather. Hoo-wee. That's a sweet one. That's a beautiful one. Yeah, look at the color. Just gorgeous. Got lucky. I suspect it's a falcon feather. Part of why I was returning here was to see this little probably a Cooper's hawk might have dropped this feather. I wanted to see some of the plants here, like the hummingbird sage, of which this is an old flower. Here's some really larger ones. And also this sage, this California sagebrush here. There's some other hummingbird sage back there, but I wanted to see my friend, this relatively developed white sage plant here. These are its flowers. Yeah. And many of the white sages I've been aware of have undergone sort of weird vivisection by humans for various reasons. Those flowers there are fully flowering branches of white sage, and these are pre-flowers, right? These ones haven't flowered yet. I'm not even sure if you can hear me when I turn the camera away. So once again, I now have both hands full, as I did last time when I almost got in trouble. In any case, as I was saying, dreaming might be the possibility of signedness, and conscious waking could be when consciousness acquires a specific sort of value, and it acquires that value by a process I would analogize as collapsing from potential, what we would usually refer to as ambiguity, into derivation or disambiguation into structure. Yeah? And while we are awake, we are mostly trapped in habits. of structuring consciousness according to methods we've long enacted and come to embody and become somewhat trapped in because they are so compelling, right? They're very compelling, these methods. And I'm approaching the scene of my last adventure, and unfortunately I don't see the I don't see the owl pellet with the skull in it that I had some modest hope of retrieving. But I do see the stump, and I do see yellow jackets returning to the nest location. Not in huge numbers. Oh yeah. Yeah, there's the location, all right. Wow, I just can't imagine how I got away with that one. I can't imagine it. I have no explanation for that. Yellow jackets are profoundly unfriendly to people standing on top of their nests. They're not particularly friendly to humans in general. In any case, the habits that we acquire and use, particularly those habits that are valuable in our relations with culture and work and machines and such, they are unfortunately crippling in many ways. Unless we are lucky enough to have, determined enough, it's not merely luck, it's also choice, or determined enough to make our livings in creative endeavors, such as music or dance or art. And there are, highly structured creative endeavors too, architecture, for example. Here's a peculiar construct, rather dreamlike in its way. It's supposed to be a stegosaurus. It may be supposed to be. All right, I'm going to take a moment and stash this feather. The habits that we are rewarded for acquiring, it's funny, I can see yellow jackets heading toward the nest even though they're relatively infrequent. And I'd like to get up modestly close to that nest and look around and see if the owl pellet that contained the strange skull, I mean most skulls are strange to me, is still there. But I'm really nervous about it because I survived the first time and I don't know how. The nest would be relatively safe to approach at nighttime, but not so much in the daytime. And this is the location where it is. And you can see a few yellow, I think I see the pellet. Yep, I do. Oh, that's interesting. The pellet is right next to the nest now. I left it on the stump. Yeah, I'll not be retrieving that pellet. At nighttime, you might get away with it. Particularly if you used an implement. So as I was saying, the habits that we acquire and enact in order to participate in culture, and particularly to have jobs and perform relatively bizarre, inhuman functions. There's a lot of raptor activity around here. It, like sort of the opposite of watching water flowing, right? Which then when we look away leads us to see flow in all kinds of, in whatever we look at, yeah? It's the opposite of that. It's the dead structured function of our waking world concerns, behaviors, habits, fears, necessities, work. And where that work is beautiful or profound, then of course it can be enriching. Unfortunately for most of us, or many of us, large portions of our lives are going to be precisely the opposite of enriching. They're going to represent relatively cruelly enforced drudgery that we have to do to keep the illusion of properly necessary structure and the layers of illusions that our modern societies not only depend upon but consistently reinforce, right? The policeman comes to think of herself or himself as a cop. The liquor store worker thinks of himself or herself as an employee, right? Just now, as I'm making this video, I received an email, and which, it's the world of work is a vortex, right? And in our time, for some of us, no part of our life is safe from it. It wants to subsume everything, yeah? And this is tragic and dangerous, and this is part of what dreaming anneals or heals or refreshes or restores. Like, it's the difference between this thing, right? This big object of metal and structure, an absolute, notice how static it is. Wind doesn't move it. Rain does not move it. Sunlight barely changes it. Yeah? The difference between that and this. And I could talk about that difference for days and in joyful preference to this. Because that other thing, it doesn't actually destroy our minds, it does something worse, it enslaves them. So we should recognize that there are inclinations of the waking mind's conceivable nature, not its necessarily its true nature or its only nature. There are properties that are supercultures and organizations and masters and the elite and the wealthy and corporations and nations and schools and prisons. They take advantage of these things to produce slaves. And it's evil. It's the closest thing to evil that is sort of ever presently common for many of us who live in these circumstances. Yeah? For those of us who have to obey the clock. For we who follow our smartphones through a living place for purposes of distraction or necessity. Now, in this moment, I'm doing that, right? I'm making a video, but at least in this situation, I am being creative. And I'm trying to use, this is an old trope of mine, right? I want to use the momentum and the elements of that have been co-opted against us, right? I want to use that momentum and those elements against the forces that cause the collapse of our creativity and our intelligence and our humanity and our structure, our minds disoriented by unnecessarily cruel purposes and deceptively enslaving aspects of our adult lives. And I remember, the imaginative wonderland of childhood with great enchantment and joy. And I also, like many of us anyway, we suffer the loss of that playful imaginary relationship with reality, which adults will tell us isn't pragmatic enough. And what they mean is, it won't help you be a slave later. One imagines the parents of birds who constantly peck at their wings because they themselves long ago had them pecked off by other parental birds, and so believe their children should not fly. And this is an analogy I often use, right? That our people and our intelligence, our creativity, our imagination is like, it's like a bizarre species of bird that has a myth that causes them to celebrate crawling and to cheer if anyone should manage to hop, but essentially to try to kill those who will fly, or to co-opt them so that they can be profitably taken advantage of without actually becoming contagious enough to get all the other birds flying again. And there's something, this analogy is very conservative compared to what's going on with human consciousness and our intelligence and such like this. The beautiful and astonishing dreaming that I experienced last night, which I'll not share here, it's a bit too personal. It was so refreshing. It restores my felt sense of meaning and purpose and, oh my goodness, this Bruggemansia again. The scent, it's just redolent. This fragrance is just redolent in the atmosphere here. There's another one here. This is the redwood, the sort of grove of redwoods in the botanical gardens. There's a peculiar kind of regal stillness and silence here. That I love. It's fascinating that we need help. An insect just flew near my eye. It's also fascinating how great eyelashes are, right? They will protect your eye from having something fly directly into it because they sense and react almost instantaneously. Not quite as quickly as a praying mantis's strike, which is unimaginably fast, I think it strikes faster than your visual neurons can fire, if I remember correctly. But yeah, fast enough to protect your eye most of the time. Lost my train of thought for a moment there because I switched tracks. I switched focuses. Oh, it's funny that the dreaming mind, right, sort of comes upon us when our nervous systems switch to something extremely old, and our bodies become largely, but not completely, paralyzed. We still continue breathing, for example. Some of us experience limb movement and such, though, and some of us actually sleepwalk, right? The idea that a phenomenon has a simple, explicit nature that is implied by the way we use language is wrong. It's just boldly wrong. And it's unfortunate that we would ever use language in this way, because it misleads us into thinking about identity in ways that are catastrophically delusional. Phenomenon that have the same name are often similar, but that similarity is falsified the more we move toward the specific circumstances of a given organism or situation or perceiver, and then things become very unique. All dreams can be said to be dreams, but there are many, many different kinds of dreaming, and many astonishingly unique modes and forms of dreaming. The hypnagogic dreams on the way to sleep differ dramatically from the hypnopompic dreams on the way to awakening, which also differ from the deep dreaming that happens somewhere in between them. I'm hoping to see, here's a pipevine swallowtail caterpillar. And here's another one. And I think I see some yellow jackets. Do they have a nest down there? Saw a couple of them floating down there. Could be a nest right nearby here. I was hoping to see a few pipevine swallowtail caterpillars, and I'm curious if I will see a chrysalis over here. Yep. Okay, so the other day when I was here, I showed the caterpillar that was preparing to make this chrysalis. Huh? And there it is. And up here is the skin of a previous attempt at crystallization. That skin is often found at the top of the chrysalis. And here's another chrysalis underneath here. And here is an evacuated chrysalis right there. Perhaps dreaming is like the crystallization of consciousness. Or falling asleep is like the crystallization of consciousness, and dreaming is the butterfly that therefrom emerges. Now, most people who know me know I'm really fascinated by dreaming, and people will think, well, what about lucid dreaming? That's the partial intrusion of waking consciousness into what I might think of as the manifold of the dreaming experience, without causing that manifold to collapse into waking. And lucid dreaming is certainly fascinating and has many peculiar avenues that we can explore, many peculiar branches. But I'm sort of more fascinated by something less commonly discussed, which is the opposite situation, the gentle introduction of the dreaming mind into the manifold of waking consciousness without it just collapsing into a dream. And this is one of the features, one of the possibilities that make psychedelic drugs so attractive. But I prefer experiences that don't require that, right? That don't require intoxication, that do not force us into non-ordinary consciousness by the introduction of medicines or poisons. Though many, many people sing the praises of these drugs, I am not one of them. And the reason I am not one of them is that I've had experiences that so dramatically transformed my waking consciousness continuously without the introduction of intoxicants that those experiences of psychedelia that I've had seem relatively trivial and misleading in comparison. So I don't want people to associate the wrong door with these experiences, yeah. And that's a subtopic. To wander in the garden is to be relieved of the visual, structured fictions and toxicity of all those machines and buildings outside this little sanctuary. And if I could, I'd spend most of my time, nearly all of it, with living places and living beings, learning from them and loving them and having relationships with them. But I live in a box in a city, and I speak to you now through a rectangle in my hand. A rectangle whose propagation has become more than a mere pandemic. A rectangle who our lives and minds now serve in relatively tragic and cruel ways. But I'm lucky enough to have been born in a time when the oceans were yet unspoiled, when Africa was still a thriving, anciently conserved array of ecological places and relationships where the Amazon was mostly undisturbed. That era is gone. The oceans are dying. The Amazon is gone. The rainforests in New Zealand, gone. Africa has been obliterated. The few remaining megafauna are being poached to extinction while we speak, even though there are brave people like a man named Damien fighting to protect them. And many others, not just him. They won't succeed, unfortunately, and they know it. But for the moment, I still live on a world where there are trees and plants and birds and insects and yellow jackets and hawks and owls, and raccoons, and cougars, coyotes, magnolias. And people interested in recovering some of the astonishing faculties and assets that underlie our capacity for human awareness, consciousness, relation, and wonder. I have high hopes, but I'm a pessimist. I'm a hopeful pessimist. I expect apocalypse and work for utopian ideas, not human utopias, but perhaps what I might more reasonably call paratopias or protopias. The possibility of our return from our long delusional waking nightmare to something resembling that both takes advantage of the progress we've made intellectually and philosophically and scientifically and mathematically, though the science is very, very dangerous for us right now. As powerful and as necessary as it is, our societies are not intelligent enough to relate survivably with the produce that science gives them. And our war machines and our industries and our machines in general are evidence of this assertion. Though I respect the scientific method, I'm terrified of what the humans will do with the results. What they do. It's not will do, and what they will do. But I still am hopeful of the possibility of a future in which humans and nature return to an enlightened union. And this is why I take the time to explore some of the fundamental aspects of our confusion and where we might find inspiration, insight, discovery, and hope. And one of those places is dreaming. May we learn to dream again together and to follow those dreams into roles and relationships and societies that are worthy of the noblest conservations that comprise the human experience. Thank you for joining me. May you be safe, well, and filled with learning. Bye-bye for now.